titled Lessons Learned on Effective Systems Change. I am Anthony, policy researcher at Engage African Foundation, and my partner here is Abhiraj. We will be the moderators for the panel today. I would like to thank our panelists for joining, Tapitha Mpamira. Derek, Kizet Mbuga, and Reverend Bill Jala might be showing up momentarily, but if not, they do send their regrets. Tabitha is the founder of Mutera Global Healing in Uganda, and it's expanded further. I'll let Tabitha speak on that. Mutera Global Healing was founded in 2015 as a response to the lack of systems and services available to address and advocate for victims of sexual violence. Tabitha and Mutera's vision is to disrupt social norms through prevention, healing, and justice. Before we delve in, I just want to emphasize that the hope of our conversation today is to provide an opportunity to share your experiences on navigating systems change and advocacy. While I have some questions prepared to help us with the conversation, if we are missing anything that you wish to speak on, please don't hesitate to share. Tabitha, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here.
All right, so to begin with, can you tell us a little bit about the founding of your work in 2015, the state of violence in Uganda at the time?
Yes, definitely. And I love to talk about this, so you will have to interrupt me and redirect me because we could be here all day. But in 2015, I traveled in rural Uganda as a therapist. I just wanted to see what I can do in this community that had a lot of orphans due to HIV/AIDS. As you know, Uganda was one of those hard-hit countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And while I'm there, I'm trying to see what can I contribute with mental health. So as I'm asking around, this one teacher just nonchalantly said, there's this little girl in class who was assaulted the day before. Why don't you start with her? And it was literally a 9-year-old who had been sexually assaulted. And everybody knew, but there was nothing they could do. There's a sense of helplessness, but also almost like an acceptance or surrender, I guess, to the way that life is. So supported that little girl. 2 more heard about it, came forward to find us, including one who was 5 years old, had been assaulted by, trigger warning, I'm not going into details, but there are sexual assault cases involved in this story. For those who are listening. So this 5-year-old had been assaulted by her grandfather, who was HIV positive. And the grandmother had actually done everything she could, but they could not come up with $5 that could have gotten her the medication PEP that could have saved her life in enough time, in the 72 hours. And hearing this, I was blown away. I was born and raised in East Africa, Rwanda and Uganda, moving back and forth due to the genocide. But I didn't even know this was happening in my backyard. And that was the first time, as I was helping these girls on the crisis piece of things, but also in the legal part of things, that it was the first time I came to terms and I was moved to actually share my own story as a survivor of child sexual violence. And I felt like they needed somebody to say, me too, to see that there is a future after you've been assaulted this way. So stepped up, helped these 3 little girls, and that is how our work started in this village, because I could see that if $5 could have saved her life, and knowing that somebody else is going through this, the other side of the world, all over the world, would make a whole lot of difference. So that's how we came to start. It was these 3 girls gave me the courage to get my own healing, and then the courage to step up and say, enough is enough. And that's how we started.
Wow. Like that experience that you had would take just immense willpower. So really, like, the only question I can ask you about that is what really, where did you find your willpower in that moment to help? And you know, that I don't know if that was kind of really that groundbreaking moment for you to advocate for change, but could you just kind of speak on what your feelings were and how you kind of move forward in that situation?
For sure. So for the first time, I realized it was this aha moment. Some people call it spirit, some people thoughts, whatever it is, that voice that kind of talks to you when you're quiet enough to listen. And it was clear as day that said, why do you get the luxury to wait when they're hurting now? Because right away I got into my head about what it takes to start an organization. I was not there. I was a PhD student, a mother of 3, and all these things happening in my life, and I had every excuse not to do it. But the calling wasn't to start up world vision or any big grand thing. The calling in that moment was show up for these 3 little girls, and starting where you are. I didn't need $1 million to pay $5 for this little girl to get PEP. I didn't need $1 million to get this perpetrator to justice. All I needed was to say yes, and everything followed. And the gift that came out of that is understanding that for me too, that became healing, because another aha moment that came up for me was I had been a mental health therapist for at least 7 years to this point, but I never gotten therapy myself ever. And I thought, well, you heal others, you're gonna get healed on the way. That's not how it works. And they gave me the courage myself too, to not only speak on my experience, but to go get my own healing, realizing that you can't take others where you have not been. And so it became almost, we're both helping one another. And so to start the organization, I had to really dig deep and understand that this is not an ask of starting some grand thing, not letting the perfect get in the way of the good. And what was needed in that moment for these girls and for all survivors is someone to say, I believe you, it is not your fault, and how can I support you? And all the support they needed in that moment was medical support, somebody to show up with them for this justice piece, and someone to really say, I've been there and you will be okay. And we're bigger than our trauma. And so that really helped me ground myself in knowing that one person would be enough. If one child was helped because I was there, that's all the calling that was in that moment. I didn't have to go out and get the whole world. In that moment, those 3 girls needing my help, needing my ear, needing to know that they are not alone. And so that's how I was empowered to really do something. I hope I answered that question.
Oh, absolutely. Like really the only follow-up question I have for that is, and I apologize if this is like a sensitive topic, then please don't feel free not to answer. You mentioned earlier that, growing up, you moved between Rwanda and Uganda. I think you mentioned, the experiences of genocide in Rwanda and Uganda, and how you were initially, you were not exposed to that kind of situation. Are there any connections that you discovered between the genocide, the experience of genocide in Rwanda and Uganda, and sexual violence and the social norms around sexual violence? Is there any connection there, or?
So it broke up a little bit, the connection between the genocide and sexual violence, both in Rwanda and Uganda.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you've like in your work, if you've noticed any experiences where the genocide had an impact on that social norm.
Oh yes, as we know, crisis times, wars, most people use sexual violence as a weapon, and then also during that process of displacement, a lot of kids are really escaping on their own, or women, and so it becomes normalized. In Rwanda, that was actually the initial work I was doing, was working with genocide survivors who are also survivors of rape. And most of the time we put that under one traumatic event, which is war, but those are really separate things. And when people have been through, I don't want to say worse things, but I guess compound trauma, they tend to think of all of it as one thing. Like, we went through a war, but when somebody has been assaulted, they don't even no longer think of that as a separate trauma. And so we found like the norms around that most people would not even report that as part of the experience because it feels like it's normal. I even hate to use that word. But also culturally, I can really, I think, comfortably speak on all of Africa with child marriage, which is a word I hate. It can be marriage. It's a child. It is child rape and kidnapped in some instances. It has all been normalized, and the biggest piece about this is the silence around it. Nobody talks about it. As you speak about the norms, nobody speaks on the perpetrators, right? The silence protects the perpetrators. So when it's happening in the home, which is usually the highest incidences are in the house, when it happens in schools, in sports, in wars, no matter where it happens, the one common factor is silence around this issue, which is why I won't stop talking about it as far as we go. And no matter what happens, like we can't fix what we have not faced. I think it's James Baldwin who said it. You might not be able to change everything you face, but you can't change it if you don't face it. I totally murdered that quote, but we have to face this challenge in order for us to change what happens. And that starts with our culture. That starts from within.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And you know, I think that ties in well to the next question or conversation piece that I wanted to at least speak on, was just taking a look at some of your work with Mutera. Like you focus on the three key values, right? Like there's like I think it's the core of your work, and if I'm incorrect on that, then please correct me. But it's prevention, healing, and justice, right? Around sexual violence. And I think that all three of those action points, all three of those core values really transcend like a broader conversation on the connection between sexual violence, trauma, mental health. Like they're like that, all of those are very integrated, right? Could you speak on those three, like just to start, could you speak on those three key values and how you incorporate that in your work?
Absolutely. And it actually ties into also the other work that I'm doing with the Brave movement. So with Mutera, it is a grassroots organization. It started out in Uganda, but now I'm going, and we know that if we're not preventing the issue, we're continually going to be supporting somebody who is struggling. But unless we start at the root, the work will never end. And my goal in life is to truly look and say, can you believe I used to do this job? Where protecting children and against sexual violence should not even be a job, should not be in a title. So prevention, that is the key to it. And there's a story told by, I forget his name, but the Upstream story, I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a very common one where he tells a story of somebody walking by a river stream and keeps seeing people jumping in and calling for help. And they're all pulling out one person at a time and one person at a time. And the whole community is just coming, pulling out as people are drowning and struggling to swim upstream. And then the other person stopped and looked up. And when he saw up, he saw that somebody was pushing people off this hill. So this one person stopped, ran uphill to stop where people are actually coming in, where they're jumping into the stream. So we could be down here pulling people out one at a time, survivors one at a time, but until somebody goes up there and stops it at the core, which I believe is breaking that silence, keeping people accountable, we will continually do this job, and it doesn't help anyone. So that's what prevention is for us. We want to get to the root of the problem and stop it. And in the meantime, we know people are being affected. So how do we support those who have already been affected? And that's where healing comes in. And healing is really holistic. It's not just sitting in a therapist chair. We know not everybody has access. Everybody heals differently. Everybody's affected differently. So we want to show up in a culturally sensitive way in the context of the survivors, to show up for them to know that one, they're not alone, and two, how can they have access? That a child in rural Malawi, and a child in Kigali, in Lusaka, everybody, individuals, adult survivors as well, that they have access. It's never too late to heal, and it's never done, right? So when we've already gone through this, that should be possible for everybody to access these services. That should be possible for some of us who have been privileged to access that, to go back and do the same for others. And so the work we do with Mutera, we also go and educate other organizations on how to be trauma informed. We've educated from doctors to lawyers to police officers to teachers, all the ways where people can reach survivors. How can they do it in a way that is not damaging? And then justice, that's where accountability comes in. In the work that I also do with Grace Movement, we also add trying to advocate and campaign on ending the statute of limitations in some of the countries. You should not have a deadline on when you're ready to report such issues. So keeping people accountable, providing healing for those who have been affected, and preventing it from the root so that it stops once and for all. Hopefully one day we'll see that day happen while we're still alive. So that's really the core of our work.
And I just going back to your story about the man pulling people from the stream. It just I was just thinking about that a little bit further, and community is really at the core of change, right? So what could we speak a little bit on how your work promotes healing and promotes a changing of social norms in the communities that you work in?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is the key to any change anybody wants to do. I do not care how much money you have. If the community doesn't have buy-in, if you are not aligned with their values or their culture. So even for somebody like me who thought, I'm fluent in these languages, I come from here, but after so many years in the US, I'm still a foreigner when I come home, because you haven't been here long enough or for a while. So when we came in, we had to ask the community what their needs are, first and foremost. We had to align with the values and use the language that they understand. The whole team came from that village. We did not bring any outsider, and they were the ones really leading the work. We were in the background, including myself. So that's one thing. Use the people from that community. They know more than you will ever know, no matter what expertise you have. And so that was the first piece. Second piece was the values. As we were working with the police officers, for example, we started with, what would be the values of somebody going into this kind of work? They want to protect, hopefully, they want to really take care of their community. So we would go to the police, instead of saying, this is where the gaps are and this is how you can do your job better. We ask, wow, you must really care about your community to do this work, because they don't get paid that much, their lives on the line. What is it that is important to you about this work? And then they'll tell us, so what gets in the way of you doing your work the best way you can? And for these officers in that community, it was transportation, because they needed resources. And so we asked what they needed, and all they needed was transport. And so we bought a motorcycle. So now when somebody reported a crime, we would send our advocate, put them on this motorcycle, take them to the place where the crime has taken place, and they would transport the person back to them. And since then, everybody started reporting and everybody started engaging. So simple things that I would have thought, oh, wow, for police to do their job in Michigan, they have all these nice cars and they have all these ways of reporting, not knowing that in a community, their needs are different. And so that's what it would take, is asking and really listening to the community. They have the answers. They might lack resources, but they have the answers. Another community we just worked in a refugee camp, all they needed were bicycles. They said it's easier to fix if something goes wrong. And these were all women who took it upon themselves to do the work. So we just need a bicycle and a phone, because they've already been walking miles to support survivors. And if I never asked that question, I would be thinking, oh, they probably need a car, it is so far, and they probably need all this. So we have to raise millions of dollars before we do anything. But listening to the people whom you are giving the services to, they know better than you. And that humility, cultural humility, is key.
And I think just from what I've been learning along the way too, the voice of the community and the voice of the people, the voice of the victims, often like that's the core of change, right? That is the voices of the communities and the victims is the core of change. In your experience, how has that voice, how has that work that you've worked alongside communities with, how has that influenced health systems in the areas that you've worked, or has it influenced the health, like changes in health systems?
Yeah, so the health systems are for the people, but also, at least I can speak on Uganda specifically. A lot of things can also be, well, globally, everything gets political as well, right? And so understanding, or when you are in a space where you're privileged enough to call out some of those, the ways in which systems are not working, through advocacy, through campaigns, when we hold our leaders accountable. And that's why I also now involved in this work that I keep bringing up about Brave Movement, because what we're doing on that part of work is advocacy and campaigns. We're calling on governments, we're putting them on we're really holding their feet to the fire on changing the ways in which we show up in healthcare systems. So we know sometimes resources are not used the right way. Who do we ask? How do we keep people accountable? And this is not just on a political level, but even in on the ground. If I'm a person who can speak to an officer, for example, that example I gave of a little girl who couldn't get PEP, on paper, in Uganda, all these things are free. So if you're looking from an international side of things and you say, wow, they are really on top of this, but you're supposed to get free emergency services after second hope, PEP, Plan B, all of these are given to you. But once you go to the hospital, you have to pay someone else if you want it in a timely manner or if it's run out. So these are ways in which we advocate. We were putting social workers in healthcare systems. In every healthcare center, if somebody shows up with such an issue, there is someone who knows the system well enough to question and hold those people accountable. So this is free and they have a right to it. So those are ways we can challenge them on the ground while we're also pushing and pushing for these voices to be on the tables too. One of the things we're pushing for is having survivors on one of the boards, a task forces I'm co-chairing is the African Union Summit Task Force. We need survivors in those rooms where decisions are made on how healthcare systems work, on how justice and healing works. If you not live that experience, you're probably working from a whole different lens than somebody who has been through it. So we have to listen, challenge, and keep the voices that have been affected on the table.
Yeah, that's really great to hear about, and just the idea of challenging norms. And I was just curious on that note. You mentioned how the normalization of some of the aspects of sexual violence in the community, and I was just curious about how stigma and even like self-stigmatization plays a role in all this.
Sure. And part of that is that, again, that silence that protects the perpetrator, right? So if somebody is not talking about who is wrong, right away from day one, girls, women have been, and we know this issue is for both girls and boys, but highly more prevalent in girls. So when I speak on girls, I experience. I'm not definitely saying it doesn't happen to boys. However, the value put on girls has always been marriage. And so when it happens to a little girl, they just leave that as that's what men do. Boys will be boys. Those kinds of narratives that have been passed down from generation to generation. And then women and girls start feeling as though they deserve this, they did something, there's been all the of what have you done to contribute to your own trauma. And so when we speak on it, we need to put that shame where it belongs, and that is on the perpetrators. And we need to educate our kids, we need to educate the adults, and that is part also the trauma-informed care that we do and trainings that we do to even understand for the survivors. Your brain will either do fight, freeze. I think you read about all those. Fight, flight, or freeze. So once a survivor starts to understand, wow, I didn't even have a say on how I responded. My brain was just trying to help me survive. The stigma and the shame kind of starts to reduce and understand that I was just trying to survive. So what does this mean? Now, it means I didn't do anything to deserve this. That's why those three things I talked about when we're supporting a survivor, the things they want to hear is it was not your fault. So that shame that we internalize, that is, and that we believe you, because as we know globally, society is always asking, it's the only crime where they ask the victim, what did you do? Where were you? They question the victim versus the perpetrator. And why is this, right? And so that stigma will only end by actually holding perpetrators accountable and validating survivors that they were doing their best to survive. And the only cause of rape is a rapist. No matter what we've been taught, the myth passed down, the only cause of rape is rapist, not what somebody was wearing, not what they were drinking, whatever the reasons are. The perpetrator is the only one accountable and the only one who should be held accordingly. So breaking the silence also helps on that self stigma and shame and guilt that comes with all of that, and as well as more survivors coming forward. Hopefully one day we will really take care of this issue the way it should be dealt with.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And I just unless Abhiraj, you want to you have another question just to change direction. I know Abhiraj, you wanted to talk about trauma and the role of trauma in your work. So I'll give you the floor, Abhiraj.
Yeah, thank you very much. One thing that I think is like important to look at is the role that transgenerational trauma may play in a relationship. And I was just curious, have you experienced any of that in your work, and have you addressed it?
Absolutely. And it's actually the topic of the TED Talk I gave was on intergenerational trauma. And even research shows that, specifically if I'm talking about sexual violence, that I keep playing around with the light. It's moving now. It's changing on me. So thanks. Anyway, so yes, intergenerational trauma, research has been shown that actually if someone in your family had been victimized, chances are their kids will be too, might be. And also we know now with the epigenetic research that mothers pass down DNA of trauma that they've experienced. And some scientists have theorized that that is so that it can prepare this child to be born with the resilience they need to survive in that environment. But whether or not the mother is in that environment when the child is born, the child already has that trauma DNA within them in order to survive. So we know that sometimes we're already born with our parents' trauma within us, literally in our DNA. And so that's one way we get this. And then if you are a pregnant woman with this kind of stress or trauma, and you give child to a baby who also has now this DNA, that somebody has to break the cycle for it to stop. And so not only that piece, But there's also the cultural piece, the norms, right? That we are taught and then we pass it on. There are those unspoken rules. When I went through it, nobody ever told me to be quiet. Nobody ever told me that you don't talk about it, you don't tell your mother. But somehow in my community, I learned that this is not something you talk about or somebody will believe you. And I use that story. I love storytelling. I'm African. I use that story of a little girl watching her mother cooking, I think turkey or chicken, and she's taking off the legs and the wings and cooking just the body. Like, Mom, why do you do that? And she goes, oh, my mom did it that way. Oh, Grandma, why did you do that? My mom did it that way. 4 generations later, their grandma is like, our pots were too small to fit the whole chicken. So we had to take up the pieces so we can fit it in. And now 4 generations later, things have changed. They have access, they have bigger pots. They're still throwing away perfectly good meat because it was passed down without ever questioning why. And so with the generational, there is that wisdom that is passed down, but also the norms and customs that are given to them. And nobody questions, why do we do the things the way we do it? Why do we let men in power take advantage of us? Now we have women who are in power. We have great men in power, but we all stay silent and not question some of the norms we find in our homes, in our communities, because how it's always been the most dangerous statement in the world. That's how we've always done it. So that generational piece will have to stop by us questioning why we do the things we do. Even the pieces that we've inherited in our DNA, that's where healing comes in, so we can really break the cycle and stop passing down that baton of norms that continue to harm people versus heal. As they say, hurt people hurt others and healed people heal others. So we want to be the ones that do the healing.
Yeah.
I told you, I talk too much. You have to interrupt me. I get excited.
No, like, look, like I said, it's all a conversation. The more you speak and the less we speak, the better, right? And what you're telling us is amazing. So keep on talking.
Yeah, and just if I were to follow up on that, you mentioned breaking the cycle, and I was just curious, in your view, are current systems equipped to deal with that at the moment? Is there something that can be done to support that? I know it can be difficult to especially go into what may be considered private matters and to go in and deal with that.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would even start with saying what's private and who does it serve? These are the questions asked if I rule law. Who benefits from the fact that it's private? Who decides what's private, right? The systems are made up of people. We are the system. And so if I break that within my own family, if I educate my children to do different, I don't always stop by that. We make up the system, and it starts with individuals in order to create change. And so usually we become afraid of that when we look at it from a macro level, but it really starts with each and every one of us by changing how I see it, how I talk about it. A quick example was when my daughter, so I talked to my kids about things that were considered private. Most of us growing up, we couldn't even call out private parts by name because that is taboo, or you don't talk about that. But I changed that with my kids. And I remember being at a party. I share the story everywhere. She was about 6 years old. She just had a lot to eat. And this man comes up to her and pokes at her stomach, goes, oh, looks like somebody had a lot of cake. And she just backed up, looked him in the eyes and said, first of all, that is body shaming. And second of all, I didn't give you permission to touch my body. At 6 years old, I probably would still even have a problem saying that in my 20s. And now a 6-year-old is empowered to say that. And so when we think of systems of how are we going to change the world, we would never move. But now this 6-year-old can do this. She will do the same at school. If one teacher can speak about it, a child will probably come forward. If one senator can stand up against a parliament member, right? So I think to change systems, we have to change with individuals, align with the values of why we do what we do, and really connect. I believe in my heart of hearts that we are all good people wanting to do great things. And we are born into systems, like you said, that work a certain way, and it's just easier to follow. But if we continue to challenge people who are in power and not settle for less, and then educate those who are coming up, change will eventually come, especially if we invest in our young people. And that's where I love working with the youth. I love what they're not jaded yet the way we are now, like, oh yeah, right, this will never change. They believe in change and they are willing to work for it. So I believe it can change, and it starts with one person at a time, as cliche as that sounds, but it really does.
No, I agree, and I think you touch on a important note here. So I was hoping you could provide some insight on how we challenge current understandings of sexual violence, of inclusion, of all that, and we promote the inclusion of victims of sexual violence, of people that experience mental health challenges within community. And how do, I guess, on a bigger note, how do we empower communities to directly challenge those norms?
Yeah. I will use the example of how we did it in this one village, and some of the pieces we already touched on around asking the community to be the lead in what they see. And I remember one teacher came up to me year 2 of this work, and she said, so we take them through experiential trauma training where they connect it to themselves versus thinking of this as those survivors, those victims. But we've all been touched by trauma. If you're human, you have been touched by it personally or through people really close to you that you care about. And once you connect to that feeling, we all have that in common. We all feel pain, we all feel anger, we have the same feelings no matter what the experiences are. And in communities, one teacher came up to me and said, you know, the first time you came here and you were telling us about this thing, I thought you're just promoting this Western craziness of problems you all have there. We don't have that here in this community. And after we started this work, survivors and kids as young as 4 were starting to report, and they were coming forward. And the community started seeing their own children tell them this actually is happening, and they could no longer look away. And we did a walk against sexual violence. And the first year we had about 1,500 people show up, walked in the street, and like, what is this? What's happening? You know, and we engaged religious leaders, we engaged schools, and you name it, all stakeholders. The second year was over 3,000 people who showed up, and everybody was finally seeing their part in this in their community. And why is that? Because they started hearing voices of those that they didn't think it was happening at home because of the silence once again. And they would see people like me say, I went through this too. So it's not about where you're from, it's not about this one village. So being connected to other voices of survivors from all walks of life also makes that real. What we always hear when something tragic happens, like everybody wants to connect it to themselves. Oh, I know that place. I've heard of that. So when you put faces to these issues, they become real for them. And I think that is where we really can reach communities. We make it real for them. This is your child, your neighbor, your niece, your nephew. What are you going to do about this? Or your wife went through this. 1 in 3 women have gone through this. 1 in 6 men, boys have gone through this. And that sounds like a number, but once you put faces to it, they can't look away. Eventually, we've had men come forward and ask me, how do we play our part? Is that they came up with the ideas. So now they have flags of safety in front of their homes. If somebody's walking in the middle of the night, they can see that this is a safe house. And these men will walk their kids to go fetch water safely. They wear shirts to identify themselves. Border borders, if you are familiar with Uganda, a motorcycle, the taxi motorcycles, they're called border borders. They usually stereotypically the troublemakers. They got involved. They came to our workshop, asked how can we be involved. So now they wear vests that say safety, border against GBV, and with a number on it. And so now they will drive kids and women. So you know who is the safe one. And now the safe one can't stop halfway and rape someone, because now you're already telling the whole community who you are. And so they came up with all these ideas, and we provided a pathway. So communities have to own it and understand, let's put a face to the problem. This is not just some random issue that comes out of the Western world. If we're talking about Africa specifically, is what they're gonna question, right? But if it's coming from their leaders and their children, their faces, we're a communal people. We are a people who look out for each other. Our culture is already embedded with the values of taking care of each other. Umunu, I think you've heard of that saying. I am because we are. So we're not gonna let another child go hungry. That's why it takes a village. It came out of Africa. So once you bring it back to the values of the people with a real face of that, really, that's what pushes me to continue. It's not fun to continually talk about your trauma, but if it helps one person also speak up, or a person put a face to the issue, I'll do this till the day I die, just so we can end it.
Thank you. Abhiraj, do you have any follow-up questions to that?
Well, thank you so much for that. I think this is a great overview of how important it is to deliver interventions that are community specific. But I think we can move on to our next topic.
Mm-hmm.
So what I wanted to ask was that, you sort of touched upon this earlier, the idea of system change, and a lot of victims of sexual health, they're usually have services that they can access in terms of universal health coverage in middle income regions. So in terms of like what the current challenges exist in those systems, and I know you've touched on this a bit, but what do you seek to change in the community health interventions to promote your mandate?
Can you say the last part one more time?
Sure. Like what do you seek to change in community interventions to sort of promote your vision?
Oh, that's a good question. I think first and foremost is that everybody is trauma informed in these interventions, in these communities, that they understand what it means, where the person is and how to meet them after they've gone through something traumatic. I know it has become kind of a popular word now, phrase, but what it really means. And that's what we've tried to do a lot of trainings in this piece. The other piece is that empathy that also comes from being trauma informed. We have gone through so much as a continent, as individual countries, that sometimes we forget how to empathize with others because we're comparing. It kind of becomes the oppression Olympics, as somebody coined that word before. Like, okay, you think this is a big deal, you should know what I've been through, or you should have seen the person I saw before. But where everybody's coming in, whatever it is that they've gone through, it is worthy of validating and living with that pain. People back to that place of compassion that can be lost through a lot of hardship, all hardship. So I really encourage that when we're talking to communities. And another piece is coming back to our values. I keep saying the word values, but that's what it really is. As a people, as an individual, what kind of world do I want to live in? What kind of my children? And it really comes down to, I want a world that is filled with peace, that has love, compassion, that takes care of one another. How would I want the next person to receive if this was my child or it was me? And so when we're making those changes, they really start with those tiny little acts of kindness in any sector, every work you're in. It sounds simple, but it's the hardest after you've had a long day of paperwork, depending on where you do, that we kind of get numb to people's pain. But coming back to to our humanity, and that is all it really is. How do I connect with you from a place of empathy, compassion, and then flipping that and doing the same for ourselves? People in this work usually do so much for others and they forget about themselves until they burn out and not do their job well. So self-compassion, first and foremost, self-care, that we also teach a lot of that, self-love. This last training we just had in Kampala, and this police officer, it's a woman, she came back the next day and she said, this is the first time I've slept through the night in my whole career. Because we had talked about a quick exercise I usually do before we begin our training. I'll do it with you too. I'll ask you to make a list of 5 people you love that you'll do anything for. And usually nobody puts themselves on that list. It doesn't matter how much time I give you. Everybody will write their parents, their siblings, their partners, and nobody has their name on this list. And so also starting with yourself. The people who are doing this work are usually giving so much to others and never enough for themselves. So both and, for community work, for healthcare, for healing, for justice, for it to really go forward, we have to start from that place of self-compassion and then compassion and empathy for others.
Yeah, I think what you just said is really very much at the heart of all advocacy work, right? So thank you for touching on that, and thank you for spotlighting that. And just to close, I just wanted to give you an opportunity, if you wish to take it, to highlight any projects that you're working on right now that you might want to promote, that you want to raise awareness to.
Thank you. Yes, so both and on that movement, we are trying to find as many advocates, survivors, and allies. Spread movement, so that we can get our voices to the AU Summit this coming February 2023. Their summit, we want our voices to be there. We want to call for demands and action. So resources are put in the right place. Survivor voices are heard, and so prevention, healing, and justice can take place. We did the same with the G7 countries, and now we're coming to Africa to do the same for African Union. So join us, connect with us on Twitter, #BeBrave, or at BeBrave Global. And then for Mutera, the same way, follow us on social media so you can keep up with what we're doing. If you want these kinds of trainings in your community for advocates, that we can prepare and help all communities to be trauma informed and also be able to stop sexual violence in your own communities. Link up with us on our website, mutera.org, and follow me individually on all social medias, Tapitha Mpamira, the same name, and we can follow up from there. It will take all of us to change it, and we each have a part to play, and we definitely can.
So thank you for having me here. Thank you for all you are doing with this festival. It's such a pleasure and honor to be part of this.
And thank you as well, Tabitha. Thank you for joining us today. It was, for myself and I'm sure for Abhiraj as well, it was such an enlightening experience, and the invaluable service that you provide to the communities that you work with is really heartwarming. So again, thank you, and thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you.